Chapter 8. Capsized. "Oh," Pam cried out when she heard about the boy in the leaky rowboat. "I'm sure he was Bobby." Pete and Bachelor Bill were worried about him too. There was no telling how long the lad could stay afloat, no matter how hard he bailed. "Yep," Hugh, the model maker, continued. "I called to the boy, but he didn't answer. I'd loaned my canoe to a friend, so I couldn't go out and help him. He was still bailing out water when his boat disappeared around the bend in the river down there." "Let's get going," Pete suggested. He thanked Hugh for his information. Then Bill sent the canoe speedily on its way. As he and the children scanned the shoreline, Bill asked whether Bobby could swim. The Hollisters did not know. But Pam said that even if he could, she was fearful he could not reach the shore. The river was so wide at various points that a small boy could easily get tired and not be able to swim too far. "Too bad he had such a head start on us," Bill said. "He could be anywhere by this time, even miles down the river. And that's where I'm inclined to think he is, as far away from that mean farmer as he could get." This remark encouraged Pete and Pam. Even when they asked 2 other people about the lost boy, and the answer was no, they did not feel so hopeless about him. Finally, Bill looked at his wristwatch. "We'd better not go any further," he said. "It's going to take longer to paddle upstream back to Shoreham. Meantime, let's stop for some lunch." "But we didn't bring any," Pam exclaimed, her hand flying to her cheek in dismay. Bill Barlow grinned and said not to worry. Reaching under the seat, he pulled out a flat picnic hamper and handed it to Pam. Then he guided the canoe to a clearing on the riverbank. For the first time on the trip, looks of concern vanished from the faces of Pete and Pam. "Thanks for packing the lunch," Pam said with a pretty smile. "You never forget a thing." He gave her a big wink. "I don't forget I have a big appetite. I'll bet I can eat as much as you too." They all laughed as the canoe touched the shore. "Here's a good spot," Bill said, "with an old fireplace where we can roast what I brought." Pete hopped out first, and after the others stepped to the ground, pulled the canoe up. Pam opened the basket to find frankfurters, rolls, and a thermos jug of milk. Pete started a fire, and Pam roasted the frankfurters on long willow sticks that Bill had gathered. All 3 were hungry from their long trip and enjoyed the delicious picnic. When they finished, Pete took an old can from the canoe. He filled it with water and doused the fire. As Pam was picking up the scraps, she suddenly exclaimed, "See what I found!" In her hand was a piece of wrapper from a loaf of bread. Pete and Bill could not understand what was so exciting about a bread wrapper, and asked her. "It's from Miller's Bakery in our town," Pam said. "Bobby took half a loaf of bread with him. Don't you remember Mrs. Bindle said so?" Pete's eyes grew wide over this clue to the missing boy. "You mean he stopped here?" "Yes." Bill agreed that this might be true, and said he was sorry not to continue the search. "Will you come back with us tomorrow?" Pete asked. The bachelor replied that he couldn't. He had to go out of town. Maybe one of his friends could continue the search with them. "I wish Uncle Russ was here with his boat," Pam sighed. Uncle Russ was the children's favorite uncle. He was jolly and always saying funny things. They loved to take rides on his boat. "We haven't seen him in so long. He must be on a trip," Pete remarked. Pam put the bread wrapper in her pocket, and they returned to the canoe. When she and Pete were in their places, Bill put one foot into the canoe and shoved off with the other. Once in midstream, he headed into the current, which was swift. The bachelor had strong arms, however, and Pete also had firm muscles. After they had paddled a while, Pam glanced back and saw a motorboat coming upstream. "Let's ask that man if he saw Bobby down the river," she suggested. As the motorboat grew closer, Bill shouted, "Say, that's the Bee Line. A friend of mine owns it." The driver slackened speed as he drew abreast of the canoe, so the waves would not endanger the smaller craft. Bill waved his canoe paddle. "Hello there, Henry," he shouted. "Hold on a minute." Henry throttled his motor down and came alongside the canoe. He was a slim young man, about 18, with black wavy hair and glistening white teeth. He smiled broadly, saying he was glad to meet the Hollisters. "Have you been way down the river?" Pam asked him. "About 10 miles. Did you see a boy in an old rowboat or hear anything about him? His name's Bobby Reed." "I saw the police boats scouting along both shores," Henry replied. "A fellow said they were looking for a missing boy." "He's the one, all right," Pete spoke up. "Oh, I hope they find him." "I do too," said Henry. "Say, you folks are a long way from home. Want a lift?" "That would be swell," Bill grinned. Pam giggled at the idea of hitchhiking on a river, but it would be fun to ride on the speedy motorboat. "I think there's room enough to lift the canoe aboard," Henry said, glancing at the deck of his boat. "But I've never given a canoe a piggyback before." Pete snapped his fingers. "You might not have to. Why don't we tie the canoe to the back of your motorboat? Bill can ride with you. Pam and I'll stay in the canoe." "Good," Henry agreed. "A river towboat." Bill thought about the idea a moment. "We'll have to tie you on with a long rope," he said, "because the wake of the Bee Line could easily upset you." Henry said he had a long rope and reached into a locker for it. He fastened one end to a metal ring in the stern of the motorboat and then handed the other end to Bill. After the bachelor attached it firmly to the wooden bar near the bow of the canoe, he stepped into the motorboat. "Have fun," he called to the Hollisters. Henry started the engine. The motorboat moved slowly until the tow line was taut. Then Henry gave her power and shot rapidly ahead. Bill watched the children for a few minutes to be certain they were safe. Pete grinned and shouted they were having a grand time, but Bill could not hear him because of the motor's roar. He turned back to talk to Henry. "Whee!" Pete exclaimed. "This is like a water toboggan." The waves made by the motorboat slapped against the canoe, sending up spray and soaking them. "We ought to have our bathing suits on," Pam giggled. "We'll get home in no time at all," Pete laughed. As they sped past several other canoes, Pete and Pam waved. Several children called, "Take us along!" The rest of what they said was lost in the wind. Holly and Ricky would love this, Pam thought as they raced toward Shoreham. Pete glanced at the motorboat, where Bill and Henry sat with their backs toward the children. Suddenly, the boy caught his breath. The rope was loosening from the boat inch by inch. Pete shouted to Bill, but the man could not hear him because of the wind and the roar of the engine. Pam now saw what was happening. She cupped her hands to her mouth and cried out too, but she could not make Bill or Henry hear her. "What'll we do?" Pam shouted to Pete. "Hang on tight." Pam fearfully clutched the sides of the canoe as the last bit of rope worked its way loose. Suddenly the canoe was adrift. It kept going forward 20 feet from the momentum, then stopped. It was caught in the backwash of the motorboat and spun around crazily. The next second, it overturned. The brother and sister were hurled headlong into the river. Pete's head bobbed to the surface first. "Pam! Pam!" he shouted. "Where are you?" At that instant, he saw his sister's hand reaching frantically above the water by the side of the capsized canoe. "She's trapped underneath it," Pete thought desperately.